Much. I learned today that I'm a multimillionaire through podcasts, so I'm very, very glad about that as well. No, just to accentuate what Honorable Elisha and Njabeleng said, uh, just to consider the potential unintended consequences of trying to overregulate and the downstream effects of that. I think we must be very circumspect in not over-regulating and then realizing that down the line we've not only frustrated an industry but actually had impacts on democratic freedoms as well. In terms of Honorable Bodlani's point, because she asked me a specific question, the chairperson of ICASA made an important intervention, which was, what problem are we solving here? So I completely accept your point. And I think it's appropriate and correct that litigation is unattainable and it's distant. But is that a podcast issue, or is that a question of access to justice? Do we need to focus on how we can give people the ability to exercise their legal rights in this realm, or regulate podcasters because we aren't creating the appropriate access to people to the courts which are there for them to exercise those rights? So the question of what problem we solve, I think, is important there. The other question, and I don't feel we are going to be able to answer it today, but we can only put it on the table, is, okay, let's assume that we have some kind of ombud or we have some kind of self-regulation. There's still 1,000 questions about how that actually works in practice. Which podcasters make up that body? What kinds of complaints go to that body? Who adjudicates? What can you do with the adjudication? So I think we need to think through those very practical questions. But I take your point that it's not always easy for people to exercise the legal rights which are actually in their hands. And then just finally on to Honorable Ngubane, who made some important points about operating in a vacuum, etc. And I hear that. And let me also concede that podcasters make terrible errors, say shocking, licentious, sometimes racist things. We've actually seen this in the podcasting ecosystem in South Africa, and I'm not here to defend that. However, I do think it's important that when we legislate, we don't legislate around specific flashpoints in the news cycle. We need to legislate around the norm. Many of the incidents which reach public attention and scrutiny, rightfully so, actually have been taken through legal channels and resolved. What we do need to legislate is the norm, which is every day in South Africa, right now as we speak, people are podcasting around the country. And they can't be regulated because one big podcaster made a terrible mistake on one day. They should be held accountable for that. If it's me, I should be held accountable for that. And my audience and the many comments I get always remind me of the mistakes I make. But I do think there is a danger that we legislate around big flashpoints in the news cycle as opposed to the norm of podcasting in South Africa. So in closing, I feel that there is a potential principled case for further self-regulation in a kind of press council setting, but I still have misgivings about the practical implementation of that. And if it's impractical, it may be correct in principle, but it might not be feasible to actually regulate at this stage. And so that practical question is one that I still have some doubt around. Thank you very much, Honorable Members.
Thank you, Sizwe. And I think something that is also really, really important when we talk about parity is, what about podcasts that originate outside of the country, but people are accessing from within South Africa? If I could please ask our panelists to keep their responses as short and no disrespect, because honestly, what you've just shown is why this conversation is so important and needs to be repeated in many further forums. Thanks. Go ahead, William.
So I think that on many levels, it's about the fact that for any member of the public, if you see something online and you want something to be done about it, there's often a sense of helplessness because you report it to the platform and it disappears into nothingness. And on some of the platforms, it disappears completely. There's no level of accountability, there's no level of transparency, and there's no level of real meaningful form of redress. And this fundamentally is something that we don't really understand as South Africans, because our new constitutional democracy is founded on exactly the opposite of that. Our constitutional democracy is founded on the basis of redress, transparency, and accountability. And those are things that we must continue to make sure we adhere to. The other problem is that when you report something on what may be allowed on Spotify may not be allowed on YouTube. The standards of different platforms aren't determined by our rights standards, they're determined by private entities. Increasingly, members of the owners of which are determined by whoever curries favor with Donald Trump, right? These are not rights-based principled approaches, which is what we need when we deal with these issues here. So I agree with the Dr. Because the key issue is that these things are incredibly difficult, but we've spent the last 2 years researching and engaging deeply on these things, and they're difficult and complex, and we need a nuanced and responsive system that can deal with these things. You need different bodies to deal with some of these sectors. You need a press council, you need a BCCSA. When we refer to the Online Safety Authority, it's the sort of thing that can start to make sure that when platforms engage and respond, they're responding and engaging on the same standards of international rights-based law that is in line with South Africa's constitutional values. It doesn't mean that we're going to then censor things, because as abhorrent as the manosphere may be, it doesn't mean we must stop them. What we do need to do is make sure that we've got all of the brilliant, clever people that Sizwe referred to, who are doing lots of podcasts, to continue to do those and then work out ways of incentivizing them. The problem at the moment is that the system is actively rewarding and incentivizing those who spread polarization, who spread hate, who spread misogyny, and who spread racism. And when we start to address that funding model and things around advertising, that's when we'll start to be able to bring in more taxes and start to hold them more accountable. So it's a big hot mess, but it's one that with appropriate steps and standards that are rights-based and in line with our constitutional values, we can solve. Thanks.
Thanks, William Odwe.
I think it goes without saying that over-regulation will really stifle creativity. But as I mentioned before, that we really need to identify the pockets that need regulation. For example, the obvious part for me was the journalism and the news part, where certain level of accuracy is required. And where I mentioned that podcasters at this current moment are not held to the same standard as journalists in that regard. And we need some sort of intervention and perhaps regulation in that regard. As in relation to that legal processes are protracted and inaccessible, I think it's a South African problem that needs intervention in the whole, as opposed to just this discussion of podcasters.
Thank you. And Uyanda.
I'll try to speak less aggressively. Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree with my fellow panelists. Just to answer the question around degrading, content on certain gender, I think we need to move away from regulating platforms, but start focusing on the actual content itself. Because if we regulate content, then regardless of where that content is, but the same standards will be applicable. If you look at, I mean, there was also a mention earlier to say we need to regulate disinformation and misinformation, but I also think we need to move beyond that and not only regulate disinformation, but also get to a point where we're promoting credible content instead. So I think, our legislation needs to be, future orientated in that way. Because if you look at, some of the biggest problems, they are caused by the fact that there are no public interest obligations for all these podcasters, and it's not just the podcasters. We're talking about podcasters today, but it's the whole online ecosystem. There's content creators, there's there's influencers. I think we still need to have these discussions, as Dimitri says, but look at a wider ecosystem. And I think one way of ensuring that there's that promotion of public interest obligations is to ensure that there's incentives. We cannot take that away. The reason why podcasters are thriving is because there is an incentive, that they get from the work they do. But if we've got, government chipping in, to incentivize, these podcasters, then there's a way of ensuring that that incentive comes with, particular obligations to produce a certain quotient of public interest information. And we've got the Universal Service and Access Fund that could also be utilized in that space. There's also been discussions of local content fund, and podcasters would need to benefit from that fund, because to incentivize them to produce credible content. And I think we've got one of the biggest conversations that we've been having is the playing field that's not level, because you've got the broadcasters that have got all these obligations, but you've got podcasters that have got none of these obligations. And I think that would be a great way to kind of level the playing field. And then the last issue is around the high data costs that was mentioned. And I think there's the incentives that I've already mentioned would also be applicable here. But I think the other key aspect would be zero rating of public interest content. So that the podcasters, if they produce that particular content, that content is zero rated. So what that does is ensures that it reaches the audiences regardless of whether they can afford data or not. But at the same time, the incentive is that it increases their viewership, because it's information that's freely accessible. But I think that's a bigger conversation to be held with, the telecoms and CASA and other players. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Uyanda, and thank you to all the members of the panel. Let me take two questions. We want to make sure that while the honorable members are here, we get as much input and engagement with them. We will have time for our guests later, and so with your permission, Chair, I'm going to move on to panel 2. I'll just take 2 questions, and if that's okay with, so let's take one question.
Sorry, Dimitri, while you do that, just when you come back for comment, Mr. Mashila did have some questions directed to him, but I think let's take the 2 questions and then you'll run up. Thanks.
Very well. Who are you pointing to? Honorable Subrati, because you're sitting outside of view,
No, it would be career limiting for me as the ANC to say I'm covered by all the other parties, but I think in the interest of time, let's allow the other industry players to engage. We'll come back if there's a moment.
Thank you. Chair, I think we need to have more roundtables. I've never seen so much agreement between political parties. We're looking, this is good stuff. Nombiso.
Good morning, good afternoon, apologies. Maybe just as an input, my name is Nomvuyiso Baji, Association of Comms and Technology. I think the most important thing that we need to be asking ourselves, panelists, is what is it that we're solving for, right? What is it that we want to be fixing? Are we fixing a system that is broken, or we want to grow the digital economy right in itself? And if we're going with the question of growth in itself, we want to say, in my mind, as a constitutional democracy, what are the things that we want to achieve, right? So in my world, I would say, simply put, because I represent the telco sector, I would say podcasters in themselves, as to the content that they are putting out there, they are driving, users to watch their content. Then you will ask yourself, do you want to regulate that? And is there a space to regulate? And I will say, simply put, I would say as a podcaster in itself, as a person, that person, I would say no. But depending as to, because a person grows, a person is able to be in competition with the traditional broadcasters, then how do you deal with that? Because I cannot imagine that Parliament or anyone for that matter will be fixated with a person that is just sitting in his or her garage, just interviewing people, and they have like 5,000 viewers, 30,000 viewers. I don't think that is the intention. I think we need to be able to respond as to what is it that we want to solve for. And at this particular point, I am still not quite convinced with all the goings that have been happening here as to what is it that we are driving for.
Yes, we've got Abongile and then the two here.
Thank you, Chair or Mr. Facilitator. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abongile Mashele. I represent Google in South Africa, but I think my input is really not going to be on the platform's behalf, but as a South African. On top of what Nomvuiso was asking about, what are we solving for? In South Africa, if you understand the content, especially on the content regulatory side of things, we have so many laws in South Africa that actually put very clear parameters on what can and cannot be said, irrespective of the platform that you're talking about broadcasting, talking about online content, even on YouTube, for instance. So the classification guidelines that you would find on YouTube, they're actually embedded built on top of the laws of that respective country. But where content regulation becomes a bit of a gray area, my friends there from FPB can tell you, is when we get into areas like offensive speech. And that in South Africa, unfortunately, it is not illegal to offend. We can flag it that what you have said is offensive. And I'll give you a case in point, which is not on platform, but in the movie industry. Inweba caused such an uproar in South Africa. But the most that you can do in terms of our content regulatory models is you can flag it, you can highlight it, and you can say, if you don't like it, don't watch it. So I always say, in terms of the content moderation tools, we already have them in the country. But if we're talking about the ethical conduct of podcasters, and I think that's then a different conversation. And then what we need to say is, where do we put the burden? Is it on the individual? Are the self-regulatory tools and instruments that we have a good model that maybe podcasters can adapt? And that's what you would get from your press councils. So that's, for me, is on the content side. I think we already have the instruments, but let's see how we can harmonize them and use them and leverage them adequately. And the conversation that I would love to have is on the economic opportunity and the benefit that is there. How do we leverage and enhance it? And I think when we're having this conversation, we should also focus on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Abongile. I see Kotatso and the gentleman in the blue. You can go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Introduce
So I speak
yourself.
to you as the CEO of Podcast and Chill Network, as well as the Director and Chairman of Leading Edge Growth, which is the country's largest alliance of YouTube content creators. So I have to express a serious concern, and the first one that I have is that there are only two people in this room today, which is myself and Dr. Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, who represent any platform of scale in this country. And my request is simple, that any discussion about regulation should not be exclusive of the very people that are building this particular industry. And I think that there should be more people that are involved and or in this particular discussion who are part of the industry. I also want to recognize that this industry, we have to recognize this industry for what it is today. And that you know, it's one of the very few sectors in the country today outside of the informal sector as well as the taxi industry that is truly Black owned in a very real way, right? So yet the biggest platforms in this space would struggle to afford a plane ticket to be at this table today. So on the issue of regulation, we're not operating in a vacuum, and this has been mentioned quite a few times, that we're already governed by the platforms and their policies, right? So you can't necessarily go out and say anything as you please, and we are governed by YouTube's global standards already as it is today. So as industry players, we're not necessarily resisting accountability, but there's already legal avenues that people can take in order to address any issues or defamatory statements of the like. So we'd recommend that we avoid any blunt frameworks that will suffocate a growing industry. The real opportunity for me is bigger than the issue of control, right? So it's the issue of growth. This room, should be asking how we can essentially scale this industry tenfold rather than focus on how do we stifle it by regulating it. And, how do we help creators monetize better is the question that I have for you. How do we formalize their operations and build sustainable businesses? So as Podcast and Chill Network, we ourselves have already created close to 100 jobs for young Black people, all of them Black people. And that is the real story in this space. So the question I have in this room is not necessarily how do we contain podcasts, but the question that I have is how do we grow it in a sustainable and scalable way? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And then Kotsatso, and if I could remind you, please, of our time constraints.
Thank you, Chairperson and Dimitri, the facilitator. My name is Kgotatso Mampa. I'm the head of legal in the broadcasting division at Prime Media. My colleague Abongile from Google pretty much took the words out of my mouth, but just to underscore, I think it was Dr. Mpofu Walsh who was speaking about potentially regulating the law of defamation online. And the question really is, what is the anxiety around possible or potential defamation? Because as I understand it, from a traditional media perspective, our job is to actually defame in the pursuit of truth. And by extension, podcasters, essentially, if we understand them, to your point, what are they? If we understand them to be playing that fundamental role of entertaining, informing, and educating, they are, by extension, really allowed and permitted within the constitutional framework of freedom of expression to defame, because the defenses are there. In fact, members of the media enjoy an extra defense. So you've got truth in the public interest, fair comment, but members of the media also have what we call the Bohoshi defense, or the reasonableness defense, which is, even if we get it wrong, we sort of defame somebody, but on the balance of probabilities, you actually did your checks and balances. The law says it's fine, because that is the democracy we signed up for. It is loud, robust, it is contentious. And I heard somebody mention the word hurtful. The law is not concerned with, our feelings, unfortunately, particularly in a robust and loud democracy. That kind of language has actually even been struck down by the Constitutional Court in the hate speech legislation. So the question is it harmful? But defamation laws already exist. And why is there a special case for online defamation is the question. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Because we have short time, I'm just going to ask Sizwe to respond on behalf of our panelists, unless there's someone that's really bursting. I really want to try and get the most out of this time. And so, Sizwe, if you'd like to respond, and then we'll move on to panel 2.
Thanks so much. I'll make 3 very brief points. One, I think podcasting and this conversation shows how this is an industry which is burgeoning, should be protected and assisted. And what has been said so far shows that an industry like this can only develop in a place like South Africa and very few other countries. In other places, you just don't have the freedom to say what we get to say. But where you sometimes have the freedom, there isn't also that much to talk about. And in South Africa, we have podcasters booming because precisely of those 2 problems. I want to accentuate what Bala said. I I think not only should the people with scale be invited into the room, there are many voices in South African podcasting which I think are excluded here. And just to accentuate the work that has been done in this industry by networks like that, and how seriously I think we need to take it. Podcasting looks so informal, but it really is a serious industry now, and that is a story that I think is yet to be told. And then I would just finally end on Ms. Mashele and Batya's points that if we shift this conversation from regulation and are podcasts a problem to, is this a question about growth, the South African economy and the South African story, I think we have a more productive conversation. Yes, podcasters need to make sure that they keep within what rules they are. But I think the most important thing is to help develop this industry rather than to constrain it.
Thank you. Thank you for being crisp and concise. And also just on behalf of the hosts on the issue of exclusion, certainly there was never an intent to exclude anyone. People were invited as they were known. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, the idea is that this conversation is just the beginning. It's going to continue across the country with different hosts, etc. So certainly, but thank you for raising it. Thank you very much to our panel. I think we can give them a warm thank you. And I'd like to invite our second panel, which will be moderated by Advocate Norman Giddy. Then it's Dr. Patiswa Magopeni from the Press Council, the Executive Director, Tina Power of Alt Advisory, Klengiwe Shelembe, who's the Senior Manager of Policy Research and Analysis at the Information Regulator, and Lerato Sima, who's the Executive Manager, Compliance and Regulation at .ZNA.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Communications and Digital Technology, DG, and the colleagues from the industry. I greet you. My name is Norman Nketeni Giddy. I am the CEO of the Films and Publication Board. I have less than 3 months in office. It is a privilege to guide this important discussion. Chair, I will be brief because of time. We meet at a time when digital expression, particularly through podcasting, is expanding faster than the system meant to protect users. Podcasting has become a powerful platform for storytelling, education, activism, and entrepreneurship. It is influential, accessible, and especially popular among young people. But with this growth comes a critical question. How do we protect people, especially children, without suppressing creativity or freedom of expression? Podcasts now function as both publishing and broadcasting tools, Yet, unlike traditional media, podcast content is on demand, unmoderated, and largely unregulated. We have noted from our chair that today's discussion is not about regulation, but it's about the discussion in terms of the frameworks that are in place. This has then made it easier for harmful, illegal, and rights-violating material to spread, which include bullying, hate speech, misinformation, sexual abuse content, and other content. To avoid fragmentation, we need integrated system, meaning that we need to work together to identify the gaps that are in place, and no single entity can do it alone. It's a collaborative effort. But regulation only is part of the solution. Online safety also depends on empowering users with clear remedies and faster support. When harm occurs, people should know exactly where to turn without needing legal expertise. They simply need clarity, coordination, and speed. We must remember, as it has been indicated here today, that podcasting is not just a cultural phenomenon. It is an economic phenomenon. Young South Africans are building business and careers in this space. As it has been indicated, over-regulating could close doors